You don't own me.
Talking about this is clean.
Oh,
this is so
fine.
clean.
No,
Fine.
no way.
Fine. You go then, and I will go my own way.
Don't tell me what to do, and don't tell me what to say. Please, when I go out with you, don't put me on display. You don't own me. Don't
Good
try
riddance.
to change me in any way.
Shit! The video! Oh, no. Right. Hello everyone! Yes! Welcome. It is the 5th instalment of Acquisition of Behaviour. Now last time we talked about learning, didn't we? Or more specifically, Pavlovian conditioning. Good old Pavlov. Now today we're going to be talking about a slight different branch of learning, if you like. We're going to be talking about recognition learning as another one of our cognitive mechanisms. So, like all the other videos, we're going to start off with a definition. Obviously, we all know what recognition is, but what do we mean by it in a behavioural ecology perspective? Okay, so our definition is to classify objects or other animals appropriately on first encounter. Now, as you might imagine, being able to recognise something is quite useful. It's very advantageous. It can increase your fitness. Because if you learn to recognise something which has an adaptive value, so will increase your fitness, that means you're more likely to survive and pass on your genes to future generations. Okay? Pretty simple. We've got a few examples here on where recognition is extremely useful. The first one is in Fulca Americana, which to you and me is the American coot, which if you've ever been down to a lake in the UK is very similar to the coot we have here. Beautiful animals. The only thing that's different about this species is that these are actually brood parasites, and they're intraspecific brood parasites, so they'll try and lay their eggs in the nests of their own species. Okay? It's pretty strange. Now, some individuals have learned to recognise their own eggs, and you can imagine that being extremely useful. So that means, as a result, any eggs which they don't see as being theirs, they'll just chuck out the nest, and they can tell that by the number of spots or the speckled pattern of the eggs. Remember, we talked about it in the co-evolution video in the evolution series with the cuckoos. You can see here that recognising is extremely advantageous because bringing up young which isn't your own has no fitness value whatsoever. It's extremely energetically costly, for starters, because you put a lot of energy into your chicks, so if they don't even contain your genes, then what is the point? Now, it's not just vertebrates that do all this recognition malarkey, of course invertebrates do. In fact, it's very important for things like social insects to recognise where their nest is. So this has been studied in social bees, but also in solitary wasps. So when the young leave the nest for the first time, what they'll do is do these things called orientation flight. So they'll go spiral round and round in circles, and what they're doing there is picking up landmarks. Now, we'll go into more about orientation and navigation in animals in a later video, but so they'll do that, they'll do the orientation flights and then fly off. Now, more experienced workers, which have been there longer, don't need to do the orientation flights, they can just fly off because they've already learned. Okay? And it doesn't matter how far away you take away the bees from its nest, they'll still find their way back. However, if you remove the landmarks, then they can't find their way back. And obviously, recognising your kid is also extremely useful, and we've kind of shown that in the coots, but mammalian example was done by Matteo on Belding's ground squirrels. Okay, so what they did, they showed these squirrels loads of unfamiliar scents. Okay, and they measured the amount of time that the squirrels spent checking them out, you know, sniffing around them and trying to work out what they are. And after multiple trials, they spent less time inspecting them. Okay, because they recognised the smell. right? Another test they did was that they exposed the squirrels to scents from their relatives, so like their mother, their grandmothers, their cousins, blah blah blah, and completely unrelated individuals. And what they found was that the squirrels spent less time inspecting the scents from their mother than they would a completely unrelated individual. So the second scent which was spent less time on was their grandmother, their second most related, okay? And so on and so on. Now, facial recognition has been shown to be extremely important in social animals, and particularly social insects, believe it or not. And a study by Sheehan and Tibbets on paper wasp showed exactly this. And you can understand why this is useful, because it helps stabilise the colony, because it prevents any aggression and helps recognise the queen, which the workers in that colony are at the end of the day doing all this stuff for. However, when the study was done on the species of paper wasp which lives in Spain, this facial recognition wasn't observed. So perhaps its behaviour is shaped by the ecology of the species. This is showing that the environment plays a role in determining whether this facial recognition is actually worth it or not. Obviously, there's been research on a lack of recognition being an extreme disadvantage to an individual, and a classic example of this is the European cuckoo and the reed warbler, which we've talked about before. Now, we can apply signal detection theory to all of this, and to work out whether there's a threshold in which we should, well, the reed warblers should accept or reject the eggs. So in places where the probability of being parasitised is low, then reed warblers should in general accept more of the eggs, right? Whereas if the frequency of being parasitised is high, then the reed warbler should reject most of its eggs. And the amount of parasitism is determined by the extent of overlap in the appearance between the host eggs and the cuckoo's eggs. Okay, and as we talked about, there's a lot of co-evolution going on. Huge evolutionary arms race going on between the two species, the cuckoo and the reed warbler. Okay, so we've seen why recognition is a good thing, why it's adaptive. But what are actually the mechanisms to recognition? Well, there are three that we're going to be talking about. The first one is habituation. Right, so what's our definition for that then? Habituation is a decrease in response resulting from a repeated stimulus. Now, this is a type of non-associative learning, and it can be just a simple reflex or entire behaviour of an animal. And tests which study habituation usually involve introducing a specific stimulus constantly at regular intervals. Okay? Now, the problem is, when doing these kind of experiments, is to distinguish between habituation and fatigue. So it is likely that the animal that you're testing stops responding after a repeated stimuli, my god that was terrible, after repeated stimuli, just simply because it's tired, not because it's habituating at all. So we must have a control for fatigue. And exactly that was done on this experiment on rats by Groves and Thompson. They measured the startle response in rats when they were given a repeated loud sound. So you can imagine, a loud sound was given, the rats jump out of their skin. And they kept introducing this loud sound and measured the startle response given by the rats. Now, it may just be that these rats were getting bloody tired of this bloody annoying noise being played all the time. So they just couldn't be bothered to do the startle response anymore. So to control for this, every 15 times they were given the loud sound, they were given a flash of light. Okay, so a different stimulus this time. And they showed that the rats gave a startled response to the light. So they weren't just getting tired. So this was habituation. And they showed that the quality of the stimulus, the number of stimulations, the timing of the stimulations, and the timing of the tests all played a part in this habituation. And they found that 24 hours later, the rats were still habituated to this sound. And they showed that wider sound intervals led to slower habituation, which makes sense really, doesn't it? Now, another use for habituation is in territoriality. And again, we'll have a whole video dedicated to territoriality in the future. But we can't have an acquisition video without talking about birdsong, can we? Let's return to that, shall we? So, birdsong in the White-crowned Sparrow by Falls and Brooks. So in this experiment, white-crowned sparrows were kept and they were exposed to the sounds of neighbouring individuals and ones which came from distant territories. Okay? And what they found was that the white-crowned sparrows were less aggressive to neighbours than they were to ones which came from further away. Which makes sense, really, because they'd habituated to the sounds of their neighbours, because they were pretty confident that those individuals weren't going to, come into their territory and want to have sex with their wife or something like that, because they're likely to have territories of their own and to have successful pairs of their own, okay? Whereas some unknown fella from afar might be trying his luck and trying to have sex with your female, okay? So here you can clearly see the advantages of habituation when it comes to territoriality. Because you don't want to waste energy fighting off someone who isn't worth fighting. Right, our second mechanism of recognition learning is perceptual learning, and this is learning characteristics of a stimuli as distinct from the characteristics of other stimuli. Now, unlike habituation, this is a type of associative learning, and it is discriminative. This can be improved over time and involves many factors. So it improves our ability to respond to our environment over time. And the first person who really started to understand this was this guy called William James. And he was a bit of an alcoholic, clearly, because he thought about it in terms of wine and distinguishing a claret from a burgundy. Now, I'm not a big wine drinker, so clearly I have no idea the difference between a claret and a burgundy. So William James stated, if you have them at the same time, you basically can't taste the difference. After repeated encounters, after repeated experiences, then you begin to develop associations of when you had each type of wine. So you could be like, oh yes, I recognise that taste. I had that when I was in the Bahamas on holiday, and I recognise Burgundy because I had it in in the Randolph Hotel in Oxford. I don't know, something like that. Yeah. So after multiple context association, a context environment can help us associate and discriminate between the two different tastes. And these three guys, McLaurin, Kay and McIntosh, developed a model using the principles of developing associations, so basically Pavlovian conditioning, and establishing inhibitory links. Okay? Now another example of perceptual learning was shown in rats. And what they did, they kept rats in these cages, and in some they had different shapes in the cage. Okay? Then rats were moved into different cages where there was a possibility of gaining a food reward, okay? And to gain the food reward, they had to press the shapes, okay? So obviously there were some which had previous encounters with the shapes and ones which hadn't. Now the first time, when they first encountered it, the shapes didn't lead to any reward at all. But it was shown that the rats that were exposed to the shapes beforehand were quicker to work out that there could be an association between the shapes and the food than ones which weren't exposed to the shapes. Okay, so our third mechanism of recognition learning is imprinting. And this was first discovered, really, by a guy called Konrad Lorenz, who realised that young birds sort of latch on to the first living thing they see, basically. And what he did, he imprinted himself upon his geese, which he kept on his farm, to the point where they followed him everywhere. He lived his whole life with these geese. And when they grew up and became adults, they even started doing mating displays to Lorenz. Rather him than me. But anyway, that does clearly, quite nicely, show how vital imprinting is. So, definition for imprinting. It's a bit of a longer one. It's fate-sensitive learning that occurs at a particular age or life stage that is rapid and apparently independent of the consequences of behaviour. So unlike perceptual learning, this is a type of non-associative learning because it has no knowledge of the outcome. Now, as this gives an indication on what an animal would choose to mate with, this is a product of natural selection. Now, there are two types of imprinting. There's filial and sexual imprinting. So filial imprinting is where a young animal develops behavioural characteristics from another animal, and sexual imprinting is when an animal works out who it should mate with. And this imprinting is often irreversible. Now, the type of stimulus, the duration of the stimulus, and the sensitive period in which that imprinting could occur all affect imprinting, the overall outcome. Now, there are three stages, basically, which I've written here. So the first one is analysis of the type of stimulus. Second is the recognition of the familiar traits. And the third is the execution of an action based on those traits. Now, obviously, sexual imprinting has a big role in determining fitness, because if you make the right choice on who to mate with, then you can prevent inbreeding or hybridization, okay, which is all very well and good. Now, a study on zebra finches wants to show exactly this. So, zebra finches were kept either with members of their own species or with Bengalese finches, another species of finch. So then, when they grew up, they tested to see which finch the zebra finch preferred to mate with. And they showed that zebra finches that had been reared with Bengalese finches did actually prefer to mate with Bengalese finches. Okay? And the second thing that they most wanted to mate with were hybrids of Bengalese and zebra finches. And the opposite was true with the Bengalese finches reared with the zebra finches. So it was shown that the adults preferred the calls of the individuals that they were imprinted on. Now, as well as preventing too much inbreeding, imprinting can also prevent too much outbreeding as well. The loss of advantageous alleles. Okay? Because if you mate with someone which is completely different to you, then you stand a greater chance of losing some advantageous alleles that you do have in the offspring. So, a study, I think this is an amazing study actually, by Bateson, looked at the Japanese quail, which I've seen pictures of it, it's quite a nice looking bird. And what they found was that these Japanese quails preferred to mate with their first cousins than their siblings, which is quite obvious because that's inbreeding, isn't it? Or individuals which were completely unrelated to themselves. Obviously still the same species, but with completely different genomes. Now, an even more impressive study was done on how this imprinting can lead to speciation. And this was done on indigo birds and their hosts. So indigo birds, just like cuckoos, are brood parasites, and they parasitise certain species of finch. Now, certain indigo birds have specific preferences for particular finch species. Okay? Now, because the young of these indigo birds are being, their parent is basically another species. So the call of the host species gets imprinted on the chick. Right? So the adult indigo bird has a call very similar to that of its host. So this could result in a preference to mating with the host species rather than your own species. And it has been shown that there is actually aggressive territorial behaviour with these indigo birds and their host species. And this is what could lead to assortative mating, which we talked all about in the evolution series. Now, as well as all these evolutionary questions you could ask, this also has some relevance to conservation as well in captive breeding programs. Because some animals, if they have too much human contact, then the chance of releasing those captive bred animals into the wild and their chances of their survival is actually quite low. So there have been things put in place to prevent human contact in captive breeding programs. For example, in condors, which are declining massively, conservationists, or people looking after the condors, use puppets to feed the chicks. Okay? Also, more extravagant, in panda conservation, obviously the panda is, in big, deep shit, quite frankly. People dress up in panda costumes when making contact with the pandas. So the pandas don't have any contact with humans at all. So when they're finally released into the wild, they're more likely to survive. What a great job that must be. I think I've got a new career on my bucket list there. Dress up as a panda in China. Now lastly, I'd like to talk about recognition at the molecular level. And an example on orientation flights of honeybees. Now we talked about orientation flights earlier in the video, and this study by Lutz and Robinson identified this protein called early growth response protein, or ERG1. And it's shown to be involved in learning and novelty detection, so detecting landmarks. And it's particularly concentrated in the mushroom bodies, which is an area of the brain in these insects which is involved in navigation. It's shown to be upregulated in young bees in these mushroom bodies. Okay, and this is the stage when they're doing these orientation flights and detecting these landmarks. So as the bees get older, the expression of this protein, the early growth response protein, decreases. It's down-regulated. Also, if there are new novelties, no, that's ridiculous. If there's a novelty in the environment, then the expression of this protein is upregulated again. Okay? So even these complex things which involve, recognition do have a molecular basis to them. Amazing. Right, that's all I've got time for today. Hope you enjoyed that. I'll see you next time where we're going to be talking about discrimination, generalization, categorization. Loads of isations in there. I'm tired. Goodbye.